Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to Midnight Mumbles. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale. But before that, please consider giving us a like and subscribing to our channel. Well, Mama says it ain't really babysitting, considering that it's my younger brother I gotta watch. Can't sit your own family, that's what she says. She calls it looking after. That's all well and good, but I also hate looking after Charlie. Mama went off to visit our Nana out at the hospital. Nana had a bad fall, and Mama goes to see her once a day at least. Sometimes I go too, but that day I had to stay home. It was harvesting season, and Dad was moving grain. "I need you out in the fields with me, Tony," he'd said. I guess Mama hadn't heard him that morning at the breakfast table, 'cause she stuck me with Charlie. Charlie's 4 years younger than me, making him 8 and me 12. Charlie tries to help out, but he's still so small, a real runt, if I ever saw one. When it's harvesting season, Dad don't like Charlie out in the fields with us. He just gets underfoot and sends Dad cussing. So I got ready to help out, pulling on my overalls and straightening my John Deere cap. Charlie was running round at my feet, pissing and moaning about me not playing with him. "Mama said you gotta watch me," he shrieked. Jesus hell, can that boy shriek? Dad was getting real irritated, and he's a pain to work with when he gets like that. I sighed and started to rack my brains, looking for something to keep the little booger busy while I helped Dad move corn. The idea struck on me, and I smiled. "Hey Charlie, how about we play hide and seek? I'll even count first." Charlie's eyes went wide. He really loves hide and seek, so I knew I had him. Of course, the first words out of his mouth were, "Regular boundaries." Living on a farm, we had to set boundaries when we played games like this. Normally, we weren't to go in the fields or the grove. We also had to stay away from the road, the bins, and the old chicken coop, which was perpetually in danger of falling to pieces. Charlie rarely went to these places anyway, but he always huffed when we set the boundaries. "That just ain't fair. There's not enough places to hide," he'd pout. Of course there was. We had 3 barns at least to tuck himself away in. But this time I thought I'd humor him. "How about no boundaries, Charlie? You can hide wherever you want. Just be careful." I paused and then added, "And you'll have to give me a little more time to find you, being as there's so many more places to hide and all." His eyes lit up, and he bounded out the door, shouting at me to count to 100 and no peeking, don't you even dare. While he searched for a hiding place, I followed my dad out to the grain bins. Dad had me help him set up the auger. We were moving some of the grain from the bins to the gravity wagon. That's not the hard part of farming, not really. You just get the auger set up and let it be. Sometimes Dad'd have me standing on the ladder of the wagon, watching to make sure everything was smooth sailing. But just as we set it up, one of the neighbors, Mr. Greenleaf, came shooting up the driveway in his truck. Dad sent me out to meet him, and he got right to the point. No shooting shit or anything. "Came to let you know that your daddy's cows got out," he said. His eyes sparkled a bit, and I could see he was enjoying giving us the bad news. I swore a little under my breath as I ran back out to Dad. My dad was none too pleased and started saying those words he made me promise never to say. He asked Mr. Greenleaf to watch the auger for a bit while he and I put the cows back, if it weren't too much of a bother. He nodded and made a show of going out to the bins, like he was some kind of hero or something. That only put Dad in a worse mood, seeing as he wasn't too keen on Mr. Greenleaf and didn't like to owe him anything. So Dad and I went out and rounded up the cows. It was a pain in the ass trying to herd up them beasts. It took us a few hours, and Dad only got madder as time went on. "They're ornery fucks." That's what he'd tell Mama when he thought I wasn't listening. By the time we finished herding, it was supper time. Dad drove us back to the farm. The cows had made some real headway, so we'd had to take his truck out on the highway. Mama was already back. I could see her car in the driveway. That was the first time that I thought back to Charlie. Shoot, I never even pretended to go look for him. My heart sank as I thought about how mad Ma would be. I bet Charlie was in there right now, crying and screaming. I'd sure catch hell for leaving him alone. To make things worse, Mr. Greenleaf had gone home long before. His truck was nowhere in sight, and he had left the auger on. "Tony, go shut that thing off," Dad said. I jumped out of the truck, and Dad went to put it in the shed. I started running towards the auger when I heard Ma calling out the front door. "Tony, you three are back. When you're done helping your father, can you bring Charlie in?" My heart froze. Charlie wasn't inside. Could he still think we were playing? My mind was running through all the places he could be hiding. Shoot, why hadn't I set boundaries? I decided to turn off the auger before going to search for him, figuring Dad would be mad if I didn't listen to him first. But even as I went up to it, I could tell something was wrong. See, the auger had been running all day, but the gravity bin wasn't full. It was only half filled with corn. That, of course, meant that something was clogging it up. Now, I ain't never been a real bright kid. I can tell you that much. In fact, I'm dirt stupid, as Mama would say. But right then, I just knew. I just knew what had happened somehow, and I started screaming and bawling my head off until Dad heard me and ran for me. "What in blue hell is wrong with you?" he shouted. Of course, the shouting stopped when he saw that the auger was clogged. He knew too. "Charlie?" His face was white. I nodded and kept on screaming. Dad tried to dig through the corn, but it's really impossible, especially when there's so much of it. I ran up and shut off the auger. Not that it would help much anyway. He kept on digging through the corn as Mama came out to see what the fuss was. Finally, he came to his senses and pulled up the door on the back of the wagon. All that golden grain started spilling to the ground. Dad tried to wade in, but the corn was coming out in a fury, and he just had to sit there and wait. Eventually, Charlie's body came into view. I was too shocked to do much as Dad climbed into the wagon and pulled him out, as though that could do any good. He pulled him onto the ground, and I saw that his skin had gone gray under the corn dust that coated him. Dad yanked open his mouth, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget seeing that. See, his mouth was all full of corn. I heard later that it was full down into his lungs too, but I wouldn't know nothing about that. I just saw that corn shoved into his throat, and I knew he wasn't coming back. Sure, Dad tried. He tried to dig the corn out while he sobbed and Mama screamed. He did his best, but it just plain didn't work. The ambulance still took Charlie to the hospital, but it was more for our sake than anything else. Charlie was deader in a hunk of wood, that was certain. Our family weren't the same after that. Mama got real quiet afterwards, never really seems to talk much. Sometimes I have to ask her questions a few times before she heard me. Dad started drinking and stopped farming. He never blames me, says it was his fault, for not having me watch my brother, but I always blame myself. It's been a few weeks since the accident. Everything's changed so fast. But there are two things I know for certain. One, every night I'll have the same dream. I'm looking for Charlie, just like playing hide and seek, but it's different, somehow. And then I see him, coming out of the field, crawling on his belly. He looks like a scarecrow, dressed just like the one we had out in the field. And he opens his mouth and eyes, and the corn just pours out. 2. I really, really wish I'd set them boundaries. I've been working for our town's little one room for over 20 years now. You know what's difficult about being a small town librarian? There are no children's librarians, no reference librarians. All the jobs in the library fall onto my shoulders, from designing summer reading programs to doing genealogical research for patrons. That last one is important. That last one is where our story begins. As a child, I helped my mother do genealogical research. For our own family, she showed me all the tricks of the trade, and by the time I became a librarian, I had already helped a lot of people back in my own hometown discover their family roots. A few weeks ago, I got an email from out of state, a woman in Oklahoma who was looking for a headstone. This is a pretty typical request. Someone can pinpoint the area or even the town their ancestors came from. That's easy, but do you know how hard it can be to find a grave if you don't know the plot number or have access to the records? First of all, most towns have more than one cemetery. Even our little town of 1,000 people has 2 cemeteries. If the grave is old enough, the writing might be mostly worn away. Without the proper or digital records, it can take hours or even days to find a grave. So I'm the grave finder. The first thing I do is try to find all the information I can on the person. Sometimes the patron is able to give me a lot of information: birth dates, death dates, maiden names, etc. Sometimes they can only give me a name, and that's it. In this case, she gave me all the genealogy she had done up to that point, along with the name Richard Sterler. Along with the grave, she wanted any information I could find on Richard's life in this area. I was pretty excited to start. This kind of research is one of the most fun things about my job. As luck would have it, Richard was a property holder, so a trip to the county courthouse to look at the records from the early 1900s, the approximate time period she gave me, turned up a hit on a farm just outside city limits. Perfect. It turned out that Richard had owned the farm from about 1918 until his death in 1934. The property was auctioned off a few years later in 1938. Strange that it had taken so long. If he had no next of kin to pass the property on to, then why wasn't it sold immediately? This was getting good. Next, I went through the microfilm of the old town newspapers. I started at 1918 and worked forward, looking for any mention of Richard and the farm. The nice thing about a small town is that nearly every incident, no matter how tiny, is recorded with precision. Around 1921, I started seeing Richard's name, but it wasn't where I expected. It was in the section on police reports, and Richard was being arrested every few months for possession and making of moonshine. The only other mention of him came in 1934 with his obituary. It was pretty nondescript and didn't mention any family or friends. I scoured the newspapers one more time, but didn't find anything else of note. Fortunately, I had an inside connection, so I filed away the relevant information and reminded myself to make a phone call later. Alright, on to the cemetery records. Actually, finding Richard's grave was easy enough. He was located in the main cemetery, just outside of town. It's just down the road from the Catholic cemetery, and markedly bigger. He was on the west end. I wrote down the plot number and continued to look through the records to see if he had any other family buried there, probably someone who had died before him. To my surprise, I found that he had purchased another plot. He had purchased it in 1921, and it had had some repairs done in 1929. Weird, right? That about covered it for my research. I decided my next move was to check out the cemetery. The woman who emailed me wanted a picture of Richard's grave, along with the location. I'd get the picture, and then I could check out the other plot he'd bought. Finding Richard's grave was as easy as I'd imagined, although I couldn't read any part of the inscription. No one had taken care of the grave in years. It sort of looked like a horror movie grave, crumbling and cracked and covered with moss. I snapped a few pictures and set off looking for the other grave. The mysterious grave Richard had bought was even further west at the edge of the cemetery, surrounded by graves much like Richard's, old and decrepit. But this headstone was significantly different. It still looked new, with no cracks, moss, or anything else. As I got closer, I realized that it didn't look stone at all. A few knocks on the side confirmed my suspicions. It was metal, and not only was it metal, it was hollow on the inside. I got in touch with the cemetery caretaker, a guy named Andrew Jones. He's been working at the cemetery since the late 50s, a bit after Richard's time. But since Andrew inherited the job from his father, I was hoping he'd have some information on the stone. "Oh, that old stone? That's an interesting story, Meredith," Andrew said. His gravely voice crackled in over the phone, and I had to struggle to hear him. "The guy who bought it, that Sterler, he had a moonshine operation in the 20s, during Prohibition. But you probably already know that." His laugh cracked like a whip, and I found myself wishing he would just get on with the story. "Right. Anyway, that's a fake grave. The panels on the side used to open up. Potential buyers would put the money in the headstone. Sterler would come that night and switch it out with his moonshine. The repairs we recorded are from when my father sealed the panels. Prohibition ended, and so did Sterler's business, so they weren't needed anymore. But didn't anyone notice the headstone? Or was Richard was doing? I couldn't really fathom that, going nearly 10 years without a single person noticing the whole operation. Oh, sure, everyone in town knew about it. Hell, Sterler's biggest buyer was the sheriff. What? My mouth hung slack. This was just the type of drama that I loved finding out about. Yup, Andrew went on blithely, clearly enjoying filling me in on the juicy details. That's how Sterler managed to stay in business so long. He and the sheriff had an understanding. Sure, the sheriff would arrest him once every few months, but it was just for show. He'd let him out of the tank a few days later, and Sterler would go right back to work. Sure used to drive his wife crazy, though. Who? The sheriff's? No, Sterler's. Suddenly, Andrew stopped. Oh, I guess I'm thinking of someone else. Sorry about that. Forget I said that. I tried to get more information out of Andrew, but he kept his lips stubbornly sealed. I hung up more confused than ever. None of the newspaper stories ever mentioned Richard having a wife. If he'd been close to any sort of family, it definitely would have been in the obituary. Luckily, I had an ace up my sleeve. I made the call I'd been thinking about since my trip to the courthouse earlier that day, the call to my inside connection. The most valuable tool in conducting research is the elderly. For some cases, they really can't help. If I'm researching something from the mid-1800s, for example, in other cases, they provide valuable eyewitness accounts that no one else can. Unfortunately, a lot of the older people in small towns won't talk about their community's darker history. They feel as though they have to protect the town's reputation by burying the past with their fast-fading bodies. A few of them, however, understand the importance of preserving history as it is, no matter how ugly or frightening. One such woman is Talka Klinkenberg. At 94 years old, she's still sharp as a tack and has been filling me in on the darker side of our town's history for the past 10 years. Although she's lived in the town her whole life, she's never harbored any warm feelings for its inhabitants. This town has a lot of sick people in it, Meredith, she once told me. A lot of sick people and a lot of sick stories, and people shouldn't forget that kind of sickness. So I called Tal Alka and we made an appointment for the next day. I headed over to her house. So old, and she still lives in that big house down on 5th Avenue, all by herself. I don't know how she does it. Anyway, as soon as I brought up Richard's name, her eyes started to shine, and she leaned forward in her old armchair. That's how I knew this would be a good story. Well, now, I was just a baby during Prohibition, but I heard a lot about Richard Sterler once I grew up a little. My father was working in the police department at the time, and, well, I don't mind telling you that he was a regular buyer of Sterlers. But as I got older, I heard him say that something was wrong with that man. I'm not surprised that Mr. Jones wouldn't tell you about his wife and child. You see, Richard and Rosemary had been married for just a few years when he bought that property, and after he bought it, he started acting really funny. He was sort of strange to begin with, you know, but after he started making moonshine, things got worse. The strain on their relationship was even stronger. After Rosemary had her baby boy, Peter, I think they named him. Anyway, about a year after Peter was born, I think that would have been 1924, Rosemary up and left, took Peter with her, and just walked out overnight. Richard never heard from her again. He really went south after that. I remember my father talking about it just after Richard killed himself. That was the final straw, he said. Sure, he lived for about 10 years after she left him, but he never really recovered. He was sort of a dead man walking. My father used to say that Richard really died in 1924 and wasn't buried until 1934. Personally, I always thought it was cruel of Rosemary to leave Richard. When you marry someone, you make a commitment to them, no matter what happens. Richard may have had his problems, but she should have stayed by his side and supported him. She leaned back in her seat, satisfied with her story, and sipped at her coffee. That's my 2 cents anyway, she added as an afterthought. I had a slightly different opinion, but I kept it to myself. Well, now I had the story, and everything made sense. No mention was made of the wife or child in his obituary because they'd left. Richard had run a moonshine operation, and he'd purchased the headstone for business. He killed himself because he could no longer handle the loneliness. No loose ends, no real mystery. But something didn't feel right, and I decided to investigate some more. I wasn't sure where to start until a question came bubbling up in my brain. Why would they seal the headstone? Sure, they didn't have a use for it after Prohibition, but why take the time and effort to actually seal it? I figured it was to ensure it wasn't used again, or maybe so that local kids wouldn't mess with it. But my curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided I was going to check it out for myself. I decided to go after dark. Cliché, I know, but that way I didn't have to worry about Andrew coming out to see what I was doing. He'd be dead drunk by then, and wouldn't notice my flashlight bobbing around the darkness. I'd also have plenty of time to do my investigation. I crept out to the west end of the cemetery with my tools and flashlight. Luckily for me, the panels had only been bolted on, so they were easy enough to remove with a wrench and a few hard tugs. A few minutes later, I'd removed the bolts and had my hand on the panel. My heart was pounding hard as I removed it gently. I knew there probably wouldn't be anything behind it, but I was still nervous as hell. I was plenty surprised when the smell hit me. You know, it had been nearly 100 years since that headstone had been sealed. 100 years of no air, no light, no nothing. So whatever had rotted in there had left a pretty wretched mess, along with a smell that had been fermenting for nearly a century. I leaned over and tried to hold my supper as my stomach heaved. A squirrel or something must have gotten caught in there when they sealed it. Disgusting. But I knew that wasn't the case. Somewhere inside me, I knew that I had to take another look. I had a pair of heavy gloves in my toolkit, so I put them on and reached inside, trying to remain calm and not blow chunks. My hand grasped something thin and brittle, and I figured I'd found the body of whatever unfortunate rodent had decayed in there, except it was too big to be a rodent, and I knew that. I pulled it out and let out a cry, a painful cry, as I finally had to acknowledge that the skeleton was that of a baby, a human baby. Tears slipped down my face, and my stomach lurched once again as I realized that I was holding Peter. I had no idea what to do. When you find something like that, how do you react? I put the body back in the headstone and bolted the panels back on. I needed time to think. In fact, that's what I'm doing right now as I write this out. I hate to leave that poor child in there, but what else can I do? I should tell someone, but who do I tell? It's about 100 years too late. But doesn't his remaining family have a right to know? He may only be tangentially related to the woman who emailed me, but she would want to know, right? Or wouldn't she? How long has she searched for Rosemary and Peter? Has she searched at all? Did she even know about them in the first place? Does Andrew know? Did his father? As I sit here, chugging my third beer, this awful thought keeps surfacing through all of these questions. Is that grave really empty? Or is someone in there? Rosemary. Dear Emily, I hope this finds you well. I have looked into your ancestor, Richard Sterler, as you requested. I'm currently working on my investigation. I'm sorry to email you before I have any concrete results, but I wanted to ask, for what reason are you doing this research? May I ask how you are related to the subject? Please let me know when it suits your convenience. Thanks, Meredith. Hi, Meredith. I hope your research is going well. Actually, I'm not looking for this information on my own behalf. Richard Sterler would be my great-grandfather, I believe. At least, I think that's how he's related. It's been very hard to find information on him. I'm actually doing this for my Uncle Peter. He requested any information I could find on him, but I quickly found that my own research skills weren't up for the task. Could I ask what you found up to this point? So glad to hear from you. Emily. My stomach sank as I read Emily's latest email. Her uncle, Peter? My mind raced back to the little skeleton entombed in the fake gravestone. No, no, it couldn't be. Peter's a common name. It could be anyone, right? I knew there was only one person who could help me at this point. As soon as I got off work, I drove down to the cemetery. Andrew was outside, stalking through the rows of tombstones, picking up old flowers, trinkets, etc. He didn't even notice me drive in and only became aware of my presence when I was a few rows away. I saw him immediately become nervous. He was definitely hiding something. Andrew, you're not telling me everything you know, are you? All semblance of tact went out the window. There was a dead child, and I needed to know exactly who it was. Andrew shifted from one foot to the other and looked down. Can't say I know what you're talking about, Meredith. I wanted to yell and scream, but I knew better. I understand people. They're not so hard to deal with, and I'd already planned for this. I pulled a few hundreds out of my wallet and handed them over. How about we go talk about this in private? His eyes widened, and I could see him calculating how many bottles of cheap beer this would buy at the local liquor store. He nodded, and a few minutes later we found ourselves in his living room, the picture window framing the quiet of the cemetery behind us. Meredith, I don't want people in town to know any more about this incident than they have to. I don't know why you're so curious about it, but whatever I tell you stays out of this town. Am I making myself clear? I nodded, and he continued. My father was very good friends with Richard. They used to knock a few beers back every few nights. That's how Richard got the fake stone set up in the first place. You think he could have done that without my dad's help? Hardly. See, Richard made a mistake when he bought that property out on 75. He thought he could make a living as a farmer, but he never really was cut out for that kind of work. Plus, those first few years, the crops didn't turn out so well. Not enough rain or sunshine, I think it was. By the time he started up his moonshine operation, he and Rosemary were pretty far in debt. The night that Rosemary gave birth, Richard showed up at our house. Mind you, this is as my father told me. I wasn't even born yet when most of this happened. Anyway, according to my father, Richard was really shaken up. He was white and trembling and looked half dead. He said something had gone wrong with the birth. See, Rosemary had twins, a boy and a girl. The boy was born healthy and hardy, but the girl wasn't doing so well. Andrew took a deep breath at this point. He paused to take a sip out of his flask. I noticed his hands had started to shake ever so slightly. You have to understand, Richard loved both those children. He was going to do everything he could to save that little girl. He started spending all his money on medicine for her, but he couldn't make enough to take her to the doctor. It became a strain on the family. And then, one night, Richard got home, and Rosemary was standing over that little baby girl. The girl was stone dead, and Rosemary was just babbling on and on about how that baby was destroying the family. They didn't have the money to take care of her, she said. She'd done them a favor by killing her, she said. Well, Richard went crazy. He loved his babies more than anything in the world, including Rosemary. He never could tell my dad exactly what happened, but he showed up at the cemetery a few hours later with a bloody sheet in the back of his car and a baby wrapped in his arms. I told you, Richard was very close with my father. Now, I don't know if what my father did was right or not. I only know that he walked out there with my father and they buried that woman under the fake stone. The whole town knew what that stone was really for, so no one was going to go looking into it. They took their time, put some turf over it. No one looked close enough to see the difference. My father wanted the baby buried with Rosemary, but Richard wouldn't hear of it, not after what she'd done. He insisted that baby be inside the stone. So that's exactly what they did. Put her inside in her christening gown and sealed it up. I never imagined you'd go looking for it near 100 years later. He looked at me accusingly. I blanched. You saw? He shook his head. I take a look at the stone from time to time. I took a closer look at it, since you'd been asking about it. I could tell the bolts had been loosened. I figured it was you that had been in, but I trust you, Meredith. I knew you wouldn't go running your mouth off about what you'd find. Figured I'd let it go. I blushed at my little crime being so easily found out, but I pressed on anyway. What about Peter? He disappeared too, didn't he? What happened wasn't really Richard's fault. He loved Peter and his daughter more than anything in the world, but he still blamed himself for not seeing the signs, not anticipating what Rosemary was going to do. He thought he had failed Peter, and so he sent him off, sent him to an orphanage. That's all there is to tell. I should have been satisfied with that response, but I'm glad I wasn't. No, there's more, isn't there? Andrew looked genuinely surprised at that. What are you talking about? The reason I came asking about the grave is that a woman down in Oklahoma started asking about Richard. After I found Richard's daughter, I messaged her asking why she was looking into Richard in the first place. She said it wasn't for her. It was for her Uncle Peter. Andrew, if Peter was in the orphanage, how would he know who his father was? Why is he looking now? Andrew was silent for a long time. I could see him struggling. I wanted to reach out and help him, but I knew this was a struggle he would have to endure himself. Finally, he spoke. When Richard killed himself, he left a note for Peter. He also left a note telling my father he wanted it sent to Peter on his 18th birthday. The thing is, my father couldn't find Peter. That was before the invention of the internet, you know, and he just couldn't find him. That letter sat in our house for years, until I decided to take up the search. I was pretty sure I found him a few years ago, down in Oklahoma. I sent the letter on a whim, never got a response back. Andrew took another nip from his flask. He looked as though a weight had been lifted off his heart. I guess it got to him, after all. I called Emily and let her know what happened. I told her I wanted to talk to Peter. I don't know if she'll let me or not. She's still fairly shocked about what happened. She cried when I told her she had another aunt. Telling her the fate of her aunt was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I hope I get a chance to tell Peter what happened. I hope I get a chance to tell him face to face. As difficult as it is, he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know his father loved him so deeply that he let him go. He deserves to know who his biological family was. And I think it may be up to me to tell him. I knew I shouldn't do it. I knew it would get me into trouble. I have this really bad habit. Whenever I go to school in the morning and come back home at night, I put on my headphones. Music just makes the subway ride more bearable. I know. It basically tunes out the rest of the world, making it more than a little dangerous, especially when it's midnight and I'm walking down a deserted street. It started when I got to Beijing, actually. My commute to Peking U is usually between an hour and an hour and a half, depending on if I leave during rush hour or not. I start by boarding a bus for about 4 stops, then getting onto the subway, lines 13, 10, and 4. In the beginning, I'd just put in my headphones during the subway ride, and only when I was sitting down with a full view of the train. That way, I could listen to my lessons and get a little extra practice in before school. Gradually, I lost my fear of giving up my hearing. I started listening to music on the bus ride. I listened to it between subway stops. Finally, I plugged my headphones in from the moment I left the house until the moment I stopped at the street vendor for my daily breakfast pancake thing. I know the dangers. When I first got to college, it was drilled into us. Never walk anywhere with your headphones in, especially at night. People will see you. People will target you. You won't hear them coming. You'll be distracted. No matter how vigilant you try to be, you'll be in danger. I think my trouble is that I never think anything bad will happen to me. Yeah, I could get mugged and murdered somewhere between Shangguan-kun and Huilongguan while Green Day blares in the background, but that would never happen to me. That kind of stuff only ever happens to other people, never me. So, when I stepped off the bus last night and onto the empty street, a few blocks from my apartment complex, I thought nothing of my Queen background music. I thought nothing at all. Well, that's not true. I did notice one thing. The bus I took had 4 or 5 monks sitting in the back, talking in solemn voices. I remember thinking it was strange, because while I'd seen monks in Beijing, their dull yellow robes sweeping the floor of the surprisingly clean subway station, I'd never seen them out as far as Changping. Then again, I am pretty new here, so what do I know? I observed them quietly for a while, and one offered me a friendly smile. So I stepped off the bus, thinking about monks and religion in Shaolin and Hong Kong action films. I hummed along to Killer Queen as I strode down the street. You know, I probably never would have heard it if not for my broken headphones. I haven't replaced them because I love these headphones. They're big black skull candy headphones that fit over my ears. Yes, that makes them more obvious, making me even more of a target. But I love the feeling of barricading my ears against the cacophony of the world. Also, the tiny earbuds that came with my iPod hurt my ears like no other. Seriously, how can anyone wear them? But as much as I love these headphones, a few weeks ago I began to notice the sound scratching in and out of the right side. I remember looking down at my cord with dismay, seeing the damage that I'd somehow managed to inflict on it. Maybe I could just replace it, but until I got home, I was stuck with my broken headphones. As I was walking down the street, I began to notice there was a strange sound. At first, I attributed it to the lopsided headphones. Of course, my beautiful Queen sounded different. One side wasn't playing. I tried to ignore it, but it persisted, even when the song switched to something by Nickelback. Why is that still on my iPod? That's the real horror story here. I switched off my music and removed my headphones, taking a quick look around. I was sure I wouldn't see anything, but it couldn't hurt to check, could it? Nothing happens to me. I'm normal. This kind of stuff only happens to other people. No one will be behind me. Except someone was. I had just reached the traffic light, and he was all the way back at the previous intersection. An entire block stood between us, and that should have been comforting enough. Except it wasn't. As soon as I saw him, I knew he wanted me. He was standing straight and tall, his arms reaching out towards me. Although I couldn't see his eyes so far away, I could feel his stare burning into me. And even though I could tell by his stature and size that he was a man, he was wearing some kind of long robe that swayed in the wind. I think I stared at him for a full minute, trying to make sense of the situation, before I realized that I should really just keep heading home. I was about to turn around when he finally moved. It was the strangest thing. He hopped. That's right, hopped. His stiff, outstretched arms bounced as each hop brought him closer to me, his unnatural stiffness locking his legs into place. His body shuddered with each jump, as though it was a terribly painful way to move. And yet, move he did, and the more he moved, the faster he became, each landing violently jolting and shaking his frame. It might have been funny if not for what I saw next. As he grew closer and closer, I began to see what he looked like. I recognized his clothing from some Chinese films I'd seen before coming to school. He looked like an official, with his long robe and round-rimmed hat, maybe from the Qing dynasty, but the cloth was torn and dirty, as though he'd been dragged through the mud. There were holes in his hat, where wayward strands of hair snuck out, whipping back and forth in the wind that pulled at the already strained clothing. He got closer. His skin was pale, so pale that it was, wait, not white, blue. Blue as though he'd been strangled. I could see something strange growing on the skin, something creeping along his flesh, as though it could consume him. On his cheek, a piece of skin had been torn and was peeling away, but I couldn't see any blood. He got closer. His fingernails had fallen off, and the skin underneath was black. His lips were torn to shreds, hanging down like threads from his swollen face. There was an awful stench filling the air as I noticed the maggots crawling in his black eyes. He got closer. He was mere feet away from me when I found my voice and managed to scream. The vigorous hopping caused his flesh to tear and sway as though it was about to fall off of his skin. The maggots thrashed in his flesh as his braided hair swung back and forth like a horse's tail. He began to open the maw of his mouth, revealing what appeared to be a collection of what were once teeth, now ground to tiny sharp knives, knives that ripped at his already disintegrating lips as he gnawed at his own mouth. I screamed and screamed, certain it was the end for me. I couldn't run now, not even if I wanted to. As I looked into those black eyes, I wondered what it would feel like to have those teeth ripping into my face. And I would have died had not the monk from the bus stepped in front of me, the one who smiled. He intervened so calmly, so smoothly, that for a moment I began to wonder if there really was such a horrible monster in front of me, lusting after my vitality. You know how in the exorcism movies, the priest always mutters some moving prayer to banish the demon. Well, this monk was silent. He didn't scream. He didn't invoke whatever spirit he believes in. Nothing. He simply produced a small mirror from the inside of his robe and held it up for the monster to see. I saw the thing's eyes flashed to the mirror, the first time he had taken his eyes off me since I saw him standing at the intersection, and the change was immediate. His jaw suddenly dropped open as though it had been unhinged. The lower jawbone ripped inhumanely from its counterpart and left to dangle by the remaining bits of flesh on his face. And the noise, oh God, the noise, I don't even know if you can call it that. I knew it was emitted from deep within what remained of his chest, but somehow it felt as though it came from all around us. It was as though the very air was vibrating, shaking with wrath and fear and hatred and pain. I could feel the sound shake through me, invading my heart and causing tremors in my hands. I held my hands to my ears and screamed again, "Oh please, anything but that horrible sound." And then, all at once, it stopped. A deep quiet settled over the street, like a thick, insulating blanket. It took me a few seconds before I was finally willing to look up. When I did, I saw the monk, along with his friends. I realized that they'd been standing behind me as he battled with the unholy beast. He was looking at me with sympathy, while his friends whispered back and forth. The monster was nowhere to be seen. The monk looked at me and said slowly, in very clear Chinese, "You should get home. You're safe now." My throat felt as though it was full of cotton. My heart trembled wildly in my chest as the men turned to leave. My whole body shook as I called out, "Wait!" The monks turned to look back at me. What? What was that? I stared into my savior's deep brown eyes, searching their severity for any hint of logic that could explain what I'd just seen. With a calm, even gaze, he uttered one word, "Jiang Shi. I think I'll leave my headphones at home from now on." One of the most important people in my life is my best friend Liz. On the surface, we seem to have nothing in common. I've got lanky brown hair. She has bouncy blonde curls. I'm weak and sickly. She's got the body of an athlete and the energy of a 5-year-old. I prefer sitting in my room and reading. She prefers trying out for every club and activity that she can find. If she's fire, then I'm ice. Despite all our differences, we're still as close as sisters, maybe even closer. It's a little strange. We met when we were both in high school, and something just seemed to click. We quickly became inseparable. We have horror movie marathons together. We do plays and mock trial together. We go out for drives together. Once, we even got lost and ended up in Iowa together. And most importantly, we both love swimming. Actually, we're both certified as lifeguards, although she's been a guard much longer than I have. Although I usually hate sports, I never get tired of swimming. The feeling of gliding effortlessly through the water, twisting and contorting my body as I speed through the blue depths, is like bursting out of a cage. Free, unbound. Fortunately for us, we live in the land of 10,000 lakes, aka Minnesota. You can't drive more than a few miles without seeing a creek, a pond, a lake, a river, or some other carpet of silvery blue water glinting in the sunlight. When summer rolled around this year, Liz and I both decided to go swimming at the national park. Although I live in a rather small town in Minnesota, we have a sizable national park just a few miles away. Imposing bluffs rise above the neighboring towns, coated with a thick abundance of trees and prairie grass. To get to the swimming hole, however, you have to go off the official paths. It's not really that hard to find if you can recognize the trampled grass for what it is. You follow through until you find yourself in a thicket of trees. Keep heading east, and eventually the trees break, and you're left standing at the edge of a small lake. Lots of kids come out here. Some of them go camping here during their senior year, almost like a rite of passage. Some summer nights, there will be couples here doing what can't be done with their parents in the house. Oddly enough, no one goes swimming. I can't say I blame them. Living in a small rural area means that there are lots of urban legends designed to keep kids entertained. One of them is about that lake, or at least people think it is. There's some legend about a lake in the park that's haunted. You go in, and you never come out. There's probably more to it, but it never interested me all that much. Of course, there's more than one lake in the park. It's really quite extensive, but the location of this supposedly haunted lake is unknown. The story was probably designed to stop kids from going swimming in it in the first place. Swimming in the middle of the woods with no adult supervision can be dangerous. Being lifeguards, this did not deter Liz and I on a hot summer day after our collection of horror films had been thoroughly exhausted. I'll admit, I was a little reluctant to get in the water at first. I've always found the little lake a bit creepy. The water is deep and dark, with this feeling of sentience that I can't explain. When I looked into the water, I felt like the water was looking back up into me, like it was waiting for me. It lapped at me feet, as though it wanted to draw me in. But I'm not superstitious, and neither is Liz. She ran into the water and threw herself down. I watched her sink below the surface and then bounce back up with ease. Hey, the water is much deeper than it looks. Be careful. Pretty soon, we were both inside, twisting through the lake's depths like fish. If we stayed close to the shore, we could touch the bottom. It wasn't long before we were dredging up mud to pelt each other with. It was all great fun until Liz had one of her brilliant ideas. Why don't we swim across the lake? I've never been over on that side. The water was deep, and we shouldn't have tried it. There's something utterly terrifying about getting halfway across a body of water, only to realize you're completely exhausted and can barely propel yourself forward anymore. I should have been more careful. I should have said no, but I didn't. We decided to race each other. We set off, slicing through the cool shadows of the lake. I didn't look back when I overtook her. I was thrilled to be faster than her. Usually, she always beat me at sports. I expended all my energy flutter kicking until my exhausted feet finally rested on the opposite embankment. I threw up my arms, heaving air into my lungs and laughing. I turned around to taunt Liz, and it was like my worst nightmare had come true. Because Liz wasn't there, I waited for a moment, confused. I figured she was just swimming underwater and would be up to take a breath shortly. But as I waited, nothing disturbed the surface of the water. No watered down blonde curls springing to life above the glittering depths. No arch back to signal a surface dive. I tried to calm myself down, but my panic was growing. No, she couldn't have. Could she? She's a lifeguard, damn it, and this stuff doesn't happen to lifeguards, right? I was about to run back into the water, knowing full well how futile it would be when the surface finally broke. I could have cried for joy until I saw that it wasn't Liz. I don't mean that she looked different or possessed or something either. That's always how it seems to go in horror stories, doesn't it? People come back, but they come back different. How I wish that were true. No, the person who came to the surface was a man. He looked like he was in his late 20s, with a strong body and long black hair. The only strange thing was his skin. It was as white as snow, as though he'd never been out into the sun. I was still worried about Liz, but I ran up to the man as he dragged himself towards the shore. Where the hell did he come from? I hadn't seen anyone swimming here when Liz and I had gotten into the water. I tried asking if he was okay, what had happened. Had he seen another girl swimming here with an athletic build and curly hair? I stopped when I realized he was laughing. He gave me a wicked smile, his eyes biting into me as they stared at my panic. He took one deep breath and said something that I'm sure I'll never forget. "She's not coming back." I tried asking him what he meant, trying to get him to explain himself, but he took off before I could get any more information. Meanwhile, Liz was simply gone. I swam back across the lake and called the police, even though she'd already been underwater for half an hour at the very least. I was going crazy with fear and despair. When the cops came, I was still doing surface dives, doing a deep search like we'd been trained to do, even though it was useless. Even though the area was so large, I could never search it all myself. I wouldn't get out of the water until they dragged me from it, kicking and screaming. They've been searching the lake for weeks. No sign of Liz. For a few days, I was in agony. I thought that at any moment the call would come, saying they'd pulled up her body. I sat in my room, refusing to eat or sleep. My parents looked at me with pity, knowing what pain I was in and what worse was still to come. But as time went on, no one found Liz. The police questioned me a few times, but I could never give them any more information. They looked for the man, but they couldn't find him. Nothing made sense. After about 2 weeks, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Not until I remembered the legend about the haunted lake. In desperation, I turned to the library. Most of our town's records aren't in digital form yet, so if I wanted answers, I'd have to sift through the old records. I started my search pretty randomly. I leafed through a few newspapers saved from as early as the late 1800s. I didn't know what to look for. When was the park established, anyway? I felt even more hopeless than before, until, completely by chance, I stumbled upon a very interesting headline. 10-year-old boy, presumed drowned, returns home 4 months after disappearance. My blood felt like ice in my veins. The adrenaline pumped through my body like daggers as I tried to read the story. The newspaper had been poorly preserved, so some parts were indistinguishable, but I could still gather the gist of the story. Redacted. Minnesota. 10-year-old Robert Hackman returned home late last Saturday evening after being presumed drowned just 4 months earlier. And Mrs. Hackman were baffled by their son's mysterious reappearance. Upon questioning, Robert revealed, was trapped. Sarah saved me, but she's gone now. Sarah McAllister, 16 years old, often cares for Robert, according to his parents. She left home on Saturday afternoon and has not been seen since. Police are... Anyone with information regarding Sarah's disappearance is encouraged to come forward as soon as possible. I checked the date, 1936. I checked a few other newspapers from later that same year, but there was no further mention of Sarah or Robert. I paged more carefully through the newspapers. The next was dated 1956. Drowned, redacted. Man comes home to wife and child 2 years after death. Redacted. Minnesota. Emily Lynn and daughter Amanda Lynn were shocked this past Tuesday when husband and father Anderson Lynn returned home on the 2-year anniversary of his drowning. I was in the kitchen doing dishes when I saw him walking up the yard. I thought I must have gone crazy, Emily told reporters on Wednesday afternoon. When questioned about his disappearance, Anderson refused to give any information on his whereabouts for the past 2 years. Some things just can't be explained. No one would understand anyway. The important thing is that I'm here now. The article went on, but didn't say much else of note. I paged through more newspapers, Anderson's words ringing in my head. What was it that he thought couldn't be understood? What, if anything, did it have to do with Liz? I didn't find another case until 1986. This one a little different than the others. 20-year-old woman returns to find fiancé missing. Redacted, Minnesota. Esther Fick of Redacted, Minnesota returned just 1 week after having been presumed drowned to find that her fiancé has gone missing. Miss Fick walked into the police station on Thursday morning. The police described her as hysterical and unintelligible. She kept telling us her fiancé, a Mr. Alan Manchester, was in trouble. Chief of Police Martin Willis told reporters. She begged us to send someone back to Silver Lake to find him, but even after sending a car out, we didn't see him. She kept going on about him being trapped in the water. We suspect her state is mostly due to shock from whatever she experienced during her disappearance. Although Mr. Manchester has been reported missing, no information has come to light as to his whereabouts at this time. At this point, my phone lit up and I saw my mom calling me home for dinner. I quickly paged through the rest of the newspapers, but Esther's case had been the last. I snapped some pictures of the cases I'd found and continued home. One of the advantages of living in a small town is knowing everyone. I personally didn't really ever pay attention to the town's gossip because it never interested me, but I knew someone who did. Hey, Mom, do you know someone by the name of Esther Fick? My mom looked up at me over her mashed potatoes, somewhat taken aback. What's this, all of a sudden? I shrugged, poking at the food on my plate. I didn't eat much lately. Nothing really. I just heard some kids talking about her at the library. My mom hesitated a little, looking at my father. He seemed to be pretending he couldn't hear our conversation. Eventually, she told me what I needed to know. You know that stuffy old house on the other side of town? The one with the gate guarded by lions? I nodded. Of course I knew it. Huge and pompous, it was the only house of its kind in our small town. All the little kids thought it was haunted. Well, that's where Esther lives. She lost her fiancé when she was younger, and ever since she's been a bit of a recluse. Not much to tell, really. Mom wouldn't say anything after that, although her tone seemed to imply that there was much more to the story than what she was willing to tell me. But in the end, I guess she did tell me everything I needed to know. The rest of the night, I thought about that house with the stone lions. I hesitated for a few days before going to see her. What if she really was just crazy? Wouldn't I be harassing a poor, confused woman? What if she wouldn't talk to me? Or worse than all that, what if this was a dead end? Regardless, I had to keep pressing forward. I had to help Liz, or at least keep my mind occupied until the police came knocking at our door to deliver the bad news. I couldn't take the idleness any longer. I called out at the gate. There was no intercom or doorbell or anything. Miss Fick, are you there? No answer, but when I tried the gate, I found it unlocked. I stepped onto the stone walkway that led to her house and wound up at her front door. I knocked hard, all while calling her name. I hoped she was there. Sure enough, the door cracked open a few moments later. She really did look crazy, staring at me from behind the door chain, glaring daggers at my eyes. What do you want? I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been waiting for. My name is Anna. I live just across town. I read about what happened to your fiancé, and I think you're the only person who can help me. Can you just listen to what I have to say, please? I thought for sure I'd get the door slammed in my face. Instead, I was met with a look of surprise, then guilt. A moment later, the chain was off the door, and it stood wide open. "Please come in." The house wasn't anything like I'd imagined. It was kept immaculately clean, far from the hoarder's haven I supposed it to be. She led me into a small living room, complete with a sofa and TV. It looked normal enough. On a shelf above the TV, I saw a picture of a young man who I assumed to be her late fiancé. I remember thinking he looked a little familiar. His picture must have been included with Esther's story in the newspaper. We exchanged a few pleasantries, and I found that she really did seem normal. She offered me tea, and I politely declined. After a few more exchanges, we got to the point. "Why would you come to me? And how did you find out about my fiancé?" "Well, it started a few weeks ago. My best friend, Liz, she went missing in the lake out at the national park. I guess she drowned. Only they can't find her body. I was in the library looking for answers, and I kept coming across these strange stories. These other people were drowned, but then they came back, and you were one of them. I have to know, what happened to you? Where were you during the time you had disappeared? Please, I need to find Liz." I could feel tears stinging my eyes, my breath caught in my throat as I tried to remain calm. Esther looked at me with such pain in her eyes, a pain that I can't describe. It was the pain of a loss that had never healed, a scar that had never stopped throbbing. She glanced out the window, her mind seeming to trail back to an earlier time. I have never in all my life told anyone what I'm about to tell you. I tell you this because you need to know, because I don't want you to suffer like I did. I was sort of like you when I was your age, lanky and quiet, but determined and with one hell of an attitude. I thought it was quite the blessing that I was marrying Alan. He never tried to rein me in, always let me run free. But that's what ended up getting me in trouble. I went out swimming with some of my friends, despite my parents telling me it wasn't safe. I was a good swimmer, so I wasn't paying attention. The center of the lake is deep, much deeper than it looks. Her eyes weren't seeing the same world I was. She'd traveled back through all those years. I was looking at a ghost of a memory. I was swimming down when I felt something grab my arm. I tried to wrench myself free, but I couldn't. I struggled until the water filled my lungs and I suffocated with a burning throat. I thought I would die. That lake. There's something wrong with that lake. I didn't die. Instead, I found myself trapped below the water. I saw someone swimming up and away from me, but I couldn't follow them. I couldn't feel my body anymore. I could only feel the water rushing through me, scattering me like ashes and dust. I went on like that for a week. Do you know what it's like, living without a body, living without being alive? It was torture. I swirled along the bottom of the lake, desperate for any way out. And then, someone else came into the water. She was full out crying now, and she rushed on as though she had forgotten me. I wish it had been anyone but Alan. Living that kind of existence, do you know what it does to you? I just wanted to escape. I would do anything. I couldn't even stop myself. I could feel myself reaching through the water, reaching with a hand that hadn't been there since I'd drowned. I grasped his leg, even as he searched for me. I grasped him, and I didn't let go. She wept for a few minutes, utterly incapable of continuing. I shivered in my seat, wishing this would all just end. Her story was driving itself into me like 1,000 needles, filling my head with all kinds of possibilities. Eventually, she was able to continue. I watched him die, putting him through that awful death. I killed him and freed myself. A few moments later, and I was rushing for the surface. My body returned to me, and my life restored. I left him in that crushing darkness, and a short pause, then a scream, like a wounded animal dying in agony. I laughed. I laughed like I'd never laughed a day in my life. I laughed because I was alive, and I laughed because I had just killed the only person who I loved in this world. And after that, I never laughed again. She wiped her eyes and looked at me with an air of finality. That lake is cursed. You think it kills people, but it doesn't. It traps them. And the only way you can escape is if you trap someone else. She got up and quietly opened the front door. I followed her in a daze. My eyes went back to that picture on the shelf, and I remembered why it looked familiar. The stranger that came out of the water. I reached the door, and she looked at me. One last time, those years of sadness and guilt etched into her skin. Now get the fuck out of my house. Esther killed herself yesterday. No one would have known if her neighbors hadn't heard the gunshot, I'm sure. They found a man inside trying in vain to put back the broken pieces of her head, sobbing and calling her name. They took him in for questioning. I wonder what they'll think when they find his name is Alan Manchester. I wonder why it took him so long to find her, but none of that matters now. It's too late for them anyway. As for me, I have made my decision. I wrote Liz a letter. Her parents let me go into her room when I told them it would make me feel better to see it one last time. I'm kind of like a second daughter to them, so they didn't even hesitate. I left the letter under her pillow where she likes to hide her books when she pretends to sleep. I hope she'll find it soon after she gets home. I would do anything for Liz. We may be best friends, but we're closer than sisters or lovers. We're as close as two people can possibly be. I think back now to what Esther said it was like, tossing and turning in those dark waters, searching for your body and never finding it. Liz didn't have a choice, but I do. I love you, Liz. Please remember to tell my parents I love them too. It's time to go swimming.